Today we ask the age-old question, who makes the best brownies? Every once in a while I try to do a mashup versus video comparing two recipes of the same dish. I have done a Tasty versus Claire Saffet showdown with chocolate chip cookies and brownies, but Tasty has two really popular brownie recipes, their so-called best brownie recipe and also their fudgy brownie recipe. I've used their best brownie recipe as my standard recipe for years now, but I had never tried their fudgy brownie recipe, so I thought I would put those two head to head. You can check out my other brownie verses linked in the description. I started by making the best brownie recipe because, like I said, it's basically second nature to me now. You use hot melted butter to bloom the cocoa and espresso powders as well as melt the chopped chocolate, and then you thoroughly beat the eggs and sugar until it's super light and foamy, to which you add your slightly cooled ganache and mix all that together, and then you sift in some flour as well as some more cocoa powder. This is not part of the original recipe, but I always fold in some extra chopped chocolate chunks. To me, the recipe is just too dry and cakey without it, and I need those pockets of melted chocolate. I guess you can consider that a knock on the recipe, but I just consider it part of the recipe now because I always do it. That gets baked up and then slammed on the counter midway through and sprinkled with flaky salt and then finished in the oven. I like how the slamming makes uniform brownies and it looks really presentable at the end. But while those were baking / cooling, I moved on to the second recipe, the fudgy brownie recipe. This one starts by creaming softened butter and sugar instead of melting the butter. The chopped chocolate is actually melted by itself in the microwave. The eggs are beaten into that creamed butter and sugar before adding in the melted chocolate, and the rest is pretty much the same. We just sift in the dry ingredients, the flour and cocoa powder, and then this recipe requires folding in that additional chopped chocolate at the end. This is a smaller recipe that makes about half the volume of the first recipe, so it goes into an 8x8 pan instead of a 9x13. So I baked these as well and noticed that they weren't even close to being done after the recommended baking time, and I actually saw that in some of the reviews that people did of this recipe. Like, they were still soupy after 25 minutes, so I let them bake at least 10 minutes longer. But either way, once both recipes were done baking, I let them cool slightly on wire racks, and then I carefully cut each one into 24 and 16 brownies respectively. Certain desserts I don't really love chocolate flavor in, but I do love chocolate cake and brownies. So I couldn't wait any longer. I plated myself up one brownie from each recipe, and it was time to dig in and see which one was best. Vanilla milk, if you know, you know. So here we are back again. It's kind of hard to see the differences with these being so dark and me not having good lighting, but these both come from the same creators from Tasty. Obviously, I've already done the showdown with Claire Saffet's, and there's probably some similarities in this smaller batch. So the major differences I can think of off the top of my head are the standard recipe has the Dutch processed cocoa powder, and the fudgy recipe just has normal cocoa powder. And in the best brownie recipe, you melt the butter, whereas in the fudgy brownie recipe, you just soften it. That presented major differences when I was whisking things together, so we'll see how it translates in the actual brownie after baking. But yeah, of course I'm going to start with this recipe because by now I've probably had it at least a dozen times, probably more than that. I pretty much have it memorized and down to a science. I know exactly how long it needs to cook and how it's supposed to look and everything. But cheers. Yep, that is just a flavor that has become nostalgic at this point. It's so ingrained into my memory and I love it. Deep, dark chocolate flavor with plenty of sugar and butter to make it rich and sweet. And of course, as I said, I always add in those extra chocolate chunks, which does kind of skew this versus, but I just have to do it every time. I mentioned that in my other video with brownies. If that makes this test invalid to you, then I'm sorry. But let's move on to the fudgy recipe, which is kind of falling apart. I had this problem with the Claire Saffet's recipe as well, but I actually baked this one more than 10 minutes longer than the recommended time. But it could have stood to bake even longer. Oh well, cheers. They weren't lying, that is the fudgiest brownie that I've ever had. The slight differences in the process make this come out super fudgy and super chewy and rich. I really dig this one. And I will say that even though I mix in chocolate chunks to both of these recipes, this one calls for 4 extra ounces, which I added like they said, but the best recipe doesn't call for any, it just recommends it at the end as a suggestion. But as a rule, I usually put 4 ounces in this one. So even though it's the same amount of chocolate in both, you're proportionally going to have more in this fudgy recipe because it's a smaller recipe. And I think that translates really well. Those outer edges are nice, sweet, and crisp, kind of like that brownie brittle you can buy at the store. So going back to the Claire Saffet's video, that one beat out this recipe in my opinion. It tasted better. And I'm gonna have to say the same thing about this fudgy recipe. And without having Claire's in front of me, I think that one would probably still beat out both of these. But I could see days when I would be more in the mood for something like this. It just really melts in your mouth. It doesn't really have the most depth of flavor like the Claire Saffet's recipe in my opinion. But I think if you swapped out the regular cocoa powder for a Dutch process in this recipe, it would be even better. But all that being said, this best brownie recipe is the one that I've made by far the most. And that's just because of, I guess, convenience and because it was the first one that I tried. But also because it always gives me larger portions, and I feel like it's just super classic, and I think a lot more people on average might enjoy this just because it's not too much. But I could see myself trying this fudgy recipe but doubling the ingredients and putting them into this 9x13 pan, and again swapping in that Dutch processed cocoa powder. And of course the flaky salt, that's the best part. But these are both amazing recipes that I would bring to a group, which is what I'm gonna do tonight with a church gathering. But if you tried either of these, let me know what you like better and let me know why. I just think side-by-side experiments like this are just really cool because there's no other way to really get in depth with both recipes and see the techniques, textures, flavors, all that. But if you want me to put two recipes against each other, let me know and I'll try it. But I am running a little late for my gathering, so I'm gonna pick all this up and get out of here. If you enjoyed this video, I appreciate your support. Thank you all for watching, be blessed, and I'll see y'all next time. Never enough chocolate.